Professor Nicholas Grossman standing by. We love to talk to Dr. Grossman, international relations professor at the University of Illinois. Many things to discuss. You know, we tend, Professor, to not think as much about what goes on in Taiwan and the imminent threat of China taking Taiwan back, which they believe is their right, and our question of whether or not we're going to step in to stop it. Over the weekend, Lai Ching-te, the current vice president of Taiwan, declared victory in the presidential elections, keeping the country democratic. What's your read on that?
Well, so this is the third election that his party, the DPP, won in a row, and that's the first time that happened in China's history. In Taiwan's history. So this is not exactly a middle finger to China, but kind of, somewhat close, because China was pushing for the alternative party, who was more friendly to Beijing, to win, and they both threatened Taiwan and they tried online influence operations, and they didn't get the results that they wanted. They can maybe, from China's perspective, see a silver lining in that DPP lost its legislative majority, but Taiwan once again elected a president who is talking about independence, not even the weird, okay, we're not really China, but we're also not separate, pretending kind of this duality that is official U.S. policy, that China, we defend Taiwanese independence, but also we acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China. And so there is a risk of heightened tensions, but I don't really think that there is much of a risk of a war for the reason that Taiwan is an island and it has a whole lot of missiles in something that they nickname the hedgehog strategy, so very, prickly. And it would be very difficult for China to invade, but China can still try to squeeze it in various ways, and this will likely inflame tensions. And with the United States as the semi-official, meaning not a treaty, but as close to it as it gets, guarantor of Taiwanese security, if China actually did invade, the U.S. would be in the way, and that could potentially be a very large war. But the point is to try to deter it, not to actually fight it.
President Xi has declared that is not just a goal, it's an eventuality. Does it happen in our lifetime?
Possibly. I think more likely what China tries to do is to continue squeezing Taiwan in various ways. Not all that different from how they ended democracy in Hong Kong. Now, granted, Hong Kong is right off the coast of China. There are bridges you can use to get there. Hong Kong had been handed back by the British to China, so they had what they called one country, two systems, and then the Chinese government crushed that and made it basically one system. And so the Taiwanese will likely see things like economic squeezing, a lot of Chinese military flights into their airspace, and ships sailing closer. But I mean, 20, 30 years, who knows? But at least for the immediate future, my guess is heightened tensions, but not actually war.
It's a weird statement to make, but isn't China more of a moderate dictatorship where there are freedoms you wouldn't find, say, in Iran and other places?
Sort of. I mean, China's not really communist in the way that it used to be. It's more a state-managed capitalism. There is degrees of economic freedom that you didn't see in, say, the Soviet Union. But also, China is quite authoritarian. They have strict control over the information system, that if you criticize the government, you criticize the leader. If you're insulting to the leader, you could get arrested. For example, one that I find funny is people have been making fun of Xi, saying he looks like Winnie the Pooh. And if you look at the pictures, he kind of does.
He does kind of.
And evidently this is a sensitive spot. And so Winnie the Pooh, the image of it, is banned in China.
Wow.
You get in serious trouble if you do that. So,
wow.
It's definitely not a free country. And Taiwan.
We thought Trump had a thin skin.
I don't know. Dr. Grossman, the last thing the U.S. needs is to get involved in another conflict, and we look at this to this Chinese and this Taiwanian, possibility here. But we're now involved with the Houthi rebels. Can you talk a little bit about them and their status now being sort of now considered terrorists again? Does that mean we impose sanctions on them? And then the retaliation the U.S. and U.K. took because of their attacking our ships in the Red Sea?
Sure. So the Houthis are rebels in Yemen. They have been around since around the 1990s, but really there's been a civil war there since 2014. And Saudi Arabia had intervened on the side of the government, and the U.S. was supporting that effort, not directly with U.S. forces, but with things like intelligence and selling the Saudis weapons. And that was both a failure and really brutal, that the Saudis bombed all sorts of places. They killed a lot of civilians in the process. Once, even in a terrible incident, they bombed a school bus. Not on purpose, but they killed dozens of kids in the process. And they failed to make the Yemeni government that was allied with Saudi Arabia control the whole country, and then just recently cut a deal. And part of cutting a deal with them was they also got the U.S. to remove the Houthis from the designated terrorist group list, which would mean they would be under various sanctions and have their finances frozen and things like that, as part of a way to try to move Yemen past the civil war. But it never really got there. And the group is quite brutal. They have, among other things, cut off water to a city of a few 100,000 people that they use as a weapon of war, and have been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity as a result of that. And now they have been firing into the Red Sea, which is the other end of the Suez Canal, kind of a narrow strip of water, that something about a full 15% or so of global trade goes through there. And by firing some rockets and drones at commercial ships from all different countries, which the Houthis claim is in solidarity with the Palestinians and about the Gaza war, but is probably more about them asserting their own power internationally, especially for their domestic audience, and looking like more of a player internationally. So the U.S. and UK mostly let these go. There are U.S. Navy ships there that would shoot down a lot of the drones or missiles that were fired, and went on for about 2 months with the U.S. giving increasing warnings, and the Houthis also shot at a U.S. Navy vessel. And so then U.S. and UK did a number of airstrikes into various Houthi military targets, and rocket launchers and stuff like that. But the Houthis were able to shoot back, and one of the reasons why the U.S. didn't want to get involved is because now the Houthis get a lot of propaganda victory from saying, look, we took a hit from the U.S. and we can still hit these commercial ships. And so now appear locked into this kind of back and forth where the U.S. tries to destroy various missiles, and they try to shoot one or two off to show that they can still do it. And it's not totally clear where that's going to go.
Can you hang with us through this break? We have many other things to discuss, including breaking news this morning that Iran has launched strikes in Iraq against what they say is an Israeli spy base in Iraq. And does that expand? I'm sorry?
Yeah, they shot into Pakistan, too.
Yeah, so does that expand the footprint of the war in the Middle East? Of course, we haven't even scratched the surface on Afghanistan. Good God, don't bring that in. On Ukraine as well. Stand by, please. Professor Nicholas Grossman at the University of Illinois. He's great. He's just great. Professor Nicholas Grossman is with us from the University of Illinois. All right, so let me just continue with the Houthi Yemen thing for a second. We lost 2 Navy SEALs in the fighting of this undeclared war. At what point do these targeted drone strikes become a bigger operation because we just can't put up with it anymore?
In Yemen, the idea of U.S. introducing ground forces or doing any sort of occupation or trying to shape the internal politics of Yemen is probably not happening. And for the same reason of getting deeply involved in another Middle East war, of trying to, babysit Middle East civil conflict, is something that the U.S. probably had enough of with Iraq, and that Yemen is such a mess with the government is also not really strong enough to take over, and the U.S.-backed Saudis couldn't, and also UAE couldn't really shape the civil war. If anything, their intervention seemed to make the Houthis stronger. So I would be very surprised by the U.S. trying to directly introduce forces. By doing a lot more airstrikes, the latest round were ones that were not retaliatory, but were attacking missiles on the launch pad before they actually shot, in which the U.S. claimed that the Houthis were going to shoot them at ships. And so there's a lot that the U.S. can do with air power. Now, something like, a few special forces quietly without telling anybody, that's always a possibility. But I would be surprised at any sort of larger intervention because it would just get the U.S. bogged down in another quagmire, which means, though, that the Houthis can probably still shoot at ships for the indefinite future, at least somewhat.
Because of, my words, not yours, the incredible, ineffective incompetence of our Congress coming up on a Friday deadline of whether or not we're going to have a budget and the government's going to stay open, and the idea of whether we're going to support the Ukraine government in their fight against Russia. And will those weapons come? By the way, weapons made here in America, which means jobs in America, but why bring logic into politics? What's the update on Ukraine, Russia? Because we've seen stories in the past few days from both sides saying, no, we're doing great.
Well, they always say, everybody in war tends to say we're doing great, that the Ukrainians have always wanted to try to project this idea of a winner. People tend to want to back a winner as opposed to a futile effort. So, they'll pretty much always say that. But it looks like Russia is at least somewhat on the march, that they have more people, they have more artillery shells. They've been getting a lot of both missiles that they fired recently from North Korea as well as artillery shells. And the Ukrainians, things like rate of fire and there has slowed. They're having to ration more, and they are able to still do quite a bit on defense, but can't try to do any offense just about anywhere based on the dwindling amount of supplies. And as Russia looks at the United States in particular, and still Europe has been doing quite a bit to supply Ukraine, but they can't really do it on their own. And so Russia looks to the U.S. and sees the political dysfunction and the disagreements in the United States and finds that quite encouraging. That one of the difficult things I think, for people to wrap their brain around this is that Russia does not see something like that as, oh, good, now is a chance for us to negotiate peace with the Ukrainians. They treat it as, oh, wait, they're undersupplied. Maybe they're starting to talk about peace. That means they're vulnerable. They're weak. Push harder. They're going to collapse. And so given that, they take the sign of the political dysfunction in the U.S. that has at least delayed and possibly won't send any more aid, which, as you note, is primarily it's old equipment from the U.S. that we then replace by buying it from American companies. And that is something that, the Ukrainians are saying that they need quite a bit. Personally, I agree with you and find it very frustrating, especially because the deal that's been under discussion in Congress is supporting Ukraine and doing border security, and also perhaps supporting Israel and Taiwan. But especially that core deal, Ukraine and border security, those are two things that I think we very much need more to address, that those are both current crises, ones that we can help improve in some fairly straightforward ways. And the fact that Congress can't just do that together is very frustrating to me. And part of the problem, since we're heading into an election year, is it also gives Republicans in Congress a political incentive to not to do something that looks like a win for the Democratic President, Joe Biden.
Which is incredible. It's just such a dereliction of duty. Give me a short answer on this because I want to get to the Middle East. But Russia says Ukraine says Russia is recruiting 30,000 new soldiers a month by emptying prisons and mental hospitals and everywhere they can find them. Any part of truth in that, or what do we know or not know?
At least some. I don't know quite about the 30,000 number. I mean, it's definitely a lot. I couldn't give you an exact answer on the number. But Russia has been just throwing bodies at the front. That's been a big part of their strategy throughout, where they don't seem to really care about, except for maybe some elite troops, how many people on their side die as long as they can continue advancing and hurting the Ukrainians. And so there have been a lot of cases of prisoners among the recruits, especially in the most intense part of the combat, where they are threatened of, it's go forward. If you manage to survive for 6 months, you're free. If you turn around, we'll kill you. And very, very few of them make it 6 months.
Iran has hit bases in Iraq and in Pakistan that they claim have Israeli spy ties. What do we do about this?
So the Middle East is complicated, which is, this is, I think,
that's the greatest understatement in the history of the world.
Yeah, but this is just another wrinkle in which it is. So Iran has had 2 terrorist attacks recently. One, an attack on a police station near the border of Pakistan that killed 11 Iranian police officers, and another suicide bombing at a processional for a general that Qasem Soleimani, who the U.S. killed about 4 years ago, but at a kind of funeral procession, a reminder for him. And that one was by ISIS. And ISIS has operated both. ISIS is fundamentalist Sunni and Iran is Shia. So ISIS has always targeted Iran. But also in general, ISIS tends to look at it as ISIS versus everybody, as opposed to, say, working with any particular country in any way. So Iran had the attack in Pakistan, which the Pakistanis are quite upset about, was reportedly in retaliation for the attack on the police station. They also hit a spot in Syria, which they said was associated with ISIS. And then there's this one in Iraq, which I can't quite figure out exactly what they were trying to do. So I've heard some reports where they say it was some Israeli something or other, which could then be an attempt to retaliate for Israeli strikes on Iranian personnel in Syria. They also said that it was something to do with terrorism, which might mean that there's always, from Iran's perspective, blaming things on Israel is good propaganda for them, and they tend to do it just like the ISIS attack. They originally said that was an Israeli bomb, even though that is not really Israel's MO. And it might be that they were going after something related to ISIS or a terrorist attack in Iraq, but also the Iraqis are quite upset about that, and Iraq has been close with Iran. And so the way that you're supposed to handle that sort of business is you don't just fire missiles into a neighboring country. You say, hey, there are these terrorists that we think attacked us here. Can you go deal with them? Arrest them, kill them, whatever, but it's on your territory. And so not doing that pissed off the Iraqis. And so now we have to see what Pakistan and Iraq and Israel all perhaps either react or don't react to this, which just adds more to the powder keg.
And then really quick on the Gaza war, the new agreement that Hamas has said, okay, we'll allow you to bring medicine in for the hostages. Will they receive that medicine? And that's a bit of good news, or are they just doing that because they want to look like they're working with somebody?
So the deal from Qatar and France, so not coming from the U.S., the people who Qatar that has helped supply Hamas at different times and has also been able to cut deals with them or broker deals with them, and France not being the U.S. at least helps a little in terms of saving face. Will they actually get medicine in? I mean, I'd say a positive in that if Qatar is announcing it publicly, it would be embarrassing for them if that doesn't work at all. So decent chance it actually happens. And Hamas, of course, would get some advantage of a pause in fighting. And that could, though, potentially be something that could build into a larger peace deal. But I mean, best guess that maybe some of the medicine actually gets to some hostages, maybe some of it gets to Palestinian civilians, and probably some of it gets diverted to Hamas fighters.
An expert on the world in general, but certainly on Asia and the wars that we fight. And his book, I mean, you've been editor and served as editor on a number of important books, but I'm specifically target people, at least for this, to Drones and Terrorism, Asymmetric Warfare, and the Threat to Global Security. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it wherever you get books, and you should, especially because, we talk about now relation to conflicts are drones. And Nicholas Grossman, we always appreciate your expertise. You make us feel better in your weird, twisted way.
Right. He does. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's part of why I'm in this business. I think that understanding stuff is beneficial. Not only it helps you deal with it better, but also helps, kind of process and maybe feel a little better about it. That stuff is not totally spinning out of control if you can wrap your brain around it.
Thank you.
And at some point, he'll tell me where his shelter is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Enjoy your day.